Hello, and welcome to LimeTube. So, recently, a YouTube channel by the name of Brandon F. Released a video titled "The First World War Was Not Pointless." Basically, a description of his arguments is, in the description of his video. As his description says, all too often the United Kingdom's involvement in the First World War is portrayed as an ultimately pointless affair in which 1,000,000 European men threw their lives away for dead ideals and romantic lies. That the war was a tragedy is unquestionable, but it certainly was not pointless, and the British Commonwealth and European soldiers, subjects, and citizens who gave their lives in that titanic struggle did not do so in vain. The First World War was inevitable, necessary, and even, for the British Empire, a just conflict. So that's his opinion. I disagree, thus why I'm making this video. I believe that World War I was unnecessary, immoral, and should not have happened, and that once it did happen, no country should have voluntarily participated. This is a response video, not a reaction. I've already seen this video multiple times, so this is not new to me. And I've prepared a counter-argument. I have a somewhat loose script in front of me that I'm reading. Also, before I start, I will say that any anger that I may show, or any strong feelings, are not meant to be personal. This is not meant to be a personal attack against Brandon F. I don't watch his channel regularly, but from what I've seen, he seems like, a nice person. I like a lot of his videos. This is just meant to be sort of an intellectual debate, so, Brandon, if you're watching, don't take this personally. I just disagree with what you said in this video. And I might get, pretty passionate about what I'm saying, because I do care. World War I is a pretty strong interest of mine. Anyway, I'll be playing his video, just so that you know that I'm not, misrepresenting his arguments. I'm going to be playing it at 2x speed, just because, I don't know, I am. I like watching videos at 2x speed. So anyway, without further ado, let's see what Brandon has had to say here.
From the British perspective, the First World War is oftentimes viewed as an unnecessary, pointless, and avoidable tragedy. A one that didn't have to happen had only cooler heads prevailed. Something that only ever resulted in the loss of millions, the ruination of millions of British lives. Now, sure, the French and the Russians, they had no choice but really to go to war because they were continental powers. They were under attack by Germany, by Austria. The war was brought to them. They had, especially in the case of France, to defend themselves.
So, this is my first difference in opinion. It's not the main focus, so I won't be spending too much time on it, but Russia joined the war voluntarily, so it was not really forced on them. France sort of joined voluntarily. Basically, they told the German ambassador that they were going to stick with their Russian alliance, so Germany declared war on them. So technically Germany was the aggressor, but not really. Yeah, it's not the main focus, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it.
The United Kingdom was defended by the English Channel, by the Navy. They were not a continental power. They did not have to go to war to defend themselves. Their going to war was absolutely a choice, and indeed, the British were the ones who declared war on Germany, not the other way around. And again, what did they achieve? What did they actually gain in the end, other than, well, a few imperial possessions, sure, but certainly nothing that was worth the loss of all those millions of lives. The war was a tragedy, an avoidable tragedy. This is oftentimes how the war is seen in popular culture, that ultimately it should not have been fought, and the only reasons why it was fought were bad ones. This is a narrative which I disagree with, extraordinarily so. Rather, the First World War was not a pointless conflict. It was not a senseless slaughter. It was not without its reasons, without its causes. It was not an unjust war. Not for the British, not for the French, not for their allies.
Alright, two things there. First of all, obviously it had its reasons. People wouldn't have died for literally no reason. I think that the reasons people died were bad reasons, but there definitely were reasons, as he said. Also, he said not for the Allies, and I think that's a bit too broad of a statement. each Allied situation was unique. So I can make a completely separate video, and I'm sure he could too, about, the French, and why they joined, the Russians, why they joined, the United States, why it joined. So, I think he shouldn't speak so broadly there.
Indeed, the most moral thing, I dare say, the most just thing, and not only that, but the most logical thing which the British people could have done in 1914 was send forward their ultimatum to the German nation and indeed declare war upon them. Now, in fairness, could the ultimatum that ultimately launched Britain into the war have been sent earlier, before Germany attacked Belgium? Yes, obviously it could have. Maybe that would have actually played a role. Perhaps they could have laid down the terms of their alliance with France much more firmly, and indeed given proper warning to Germany, hey, if you attack France, we will go in to aid them. If you attack through Belgium, we will go in to aid them. They could have done things better. Yes, absolutely. And indeed, is it possible that war could have been avoided? Maybe it could have been, had everything been a little bit different. Although, in fairness, given the powder keg that was Europe, I think we can say ultimately the war would have started eventually anyways. It just depends on the circumstances under which it does, but that's beside the point. Given the events that happened up to 1914 and up to the beginning of the war, I dare say that the British people truly had no other option but to go to war, and their decision to go to war was a purely moral one, and, well, there are other interests involved, of course, but it was a wholly, I should say, moral one. It was a good one. Really, had the British decided to not go to war in 1914, they would have damned themselves in more ways than one, many more ways than one. The First World War was not a pointless conflict, but a genuine crusade, in many ways, against Imperial Germany, against the Kaiserreich.
Just a quick aside about the word, Kaiserreich. First of all, using the word Kaiserreich comes from, there's a video game community about history. It's called Hearts of Iron 4, and one mod for the game is called Kaiserreich, so that's where he gets the term from, and since then it's been used by various internet communities to describe the German Empire. I personally don't like the term Kaiserreich, because, one, Kaiser, though the German Empire did have a Kaiser and he was important, he wasn't the basis of the empire. The empire was also founded largely on nationalism and oftentimes religious nationalism. And also Reich. The term Reich or realms in German history is not really one that's used by historians, by most historians, I would say, because it was invented by the Nazis to justify them coming to power. It's been used by the Nazis and I would say unintentionally by people since then, including Brandon, to tie links between the Nazis and previous German empires to give legitimacy to the Nazis. So again, the whole idea of Reichs is not really something that most historians use, so I don't use it. It's more of a semantics thing, but I just don't really like the term Kaiserreich because of those reasons.
One which could not have been avoided. Not if the future of the British people, of the Empire, and indeed the honour of old England, if you want to get romantic about it, could ever hope to be preserved. Now allow me to explain myself here, because I understand it's very much going against the grain to suggest that the First World War was indeed a noble and good conflict, if also a one in which obviously an extraordinary number of tragedies did take place. But indeed I think much like the Second World War is oftentimes viewed as a moral, as a just war in fighting against the just unequivocal terror and evil of Nazi Germany, well I think that the First World War deserves a bit more credit along those sorts of lines as well. Now obviously, Imperial Germany, the Kaiserreich, was nowhere near the absolute evil that Nazi Germany was, but it was, when compared to other powers at the time, really quite nasty in their own right. Now, first things first, let's start off with Belgium. Because, of course, whenever we're talking about the British nation in the First World War, and particularly why they got into the conflict, you have to talk about Belgium, because that really is the entire reason for the British getting involved. At least it's the most immediate, the most direct reason for them getting involved. Belgium was, by treaty of the British and the Germans, they had signed on to this treaty earlier, a neutral country. The Germans had earlier promised that they would not engage Belgium in a potential war between great powers. Her neutrality was guaranteed by the nations of Europe. In 1914, the Germans realized that if they were going to have any hope of winning this two-front war, they had to knock France out right off the start, right off the beginning, right off the bat. And in order to do so, the best possible way was to move through Belgium. It makes sense why they did it. There is a logical reason for it. It wasn't just pure malice. There's a logical reason why they went through Belgium. But all the same, that does not, because it makes sense, that does not justify the action. It was highly illegal according to their own treaties, but the Germans derided these treaties as mere scraps of paper in the world of realpolitik, something that they can brush aside on an as-needed basis.
Right, this is hyperbolic of him to say. One broken treaty does not mean a complete disregard for written agreements on the part of the Germans. They obviously did disregard that specific treaty, but it wasn't because they just viewed it as scraps of paper. They weren't like savages.
That's what they did. They attacked Belgium not really by surprise. A lot of people were expecting it, but people were hesitant to send soldiers in to reinforce Belgium because no one wanted to be seen as the first aggressor, that sort of thing. But the Germans, when they attack Belgium, violate that neutrality. Now, the initial plan was for the Germans to move through Belgium, and perhaps if they did just move through Belgium, just walk along the streets, ignore the soldiers, ignore the towns, ignore the civilians, all that sort of thing, if they had just used Belgium as a highway of sorts, well then perhaps things may have ended differently, because with the invasion of Belgium, the British suddenly had the casus belli, if you will. They had the justification, the legal, the technical, if you will, justification to enter into the conflict, because of course they had signed a treaty with Belgium. And of course, if at that point alone, when the German soldiers enter into Belgium, and in that way become the first aggressors of this new global war, from that point, if the British violated their treaty with Belgium, if they betrayed the trust that they had with the Belgian nation, and did not go to war in aid of them, as they had continually promised to do so, well, imagine the situation that would leave the British Empire in. After the war, who is to say that any other allies would ever trust them again?
Alright, who's to say that any allies would ever trust them again? No. Like, neutrality would hurt Britain's reputation. I mean, obviously. But there are plenty of examples of broken treaties which led to nothing. There were previous treaties broken by the British Empire. One example of which just I found pretty quickly was the Treaty of Paris 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War. Britain signed that, but still kept troops in American territory. Yet somehow, Britain and America eventually became allies, even despite that broken treaty. And as another more recent example, Italy, during World War I, broke the Triple Alliance they made with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy still became a trusted ally of the British and others. Nazi Germany was able to make plenty of agreements even after breaking treaties with Czechoslovakia and Poland. They were able to make the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were able to make alliances with Italy and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and Finland. So Britain staying neutral would not completely, mean that nobody would be willing to trust them ever again. Because people would. Again, one broken treaty does not mean a complete disregard for all written agreements, all treaties.
French and the Belgians would both despise the British, on whom they relied, in part at least, for their protection. Are the British going to be able to go to Russia and start saying, hey, so we lost our allies over here, can you maybe, help us out with some treaties and whatnot? The Russians aren't going to agree, especially after the beating and suffering that they had experienced in the war. Could they go to the United States, to the rest of their empire even? Could they look to Canada, or Australia, or the Union of South Africa and say, well, but we're still good, right? We're still buddies. I mean, yeah, we betrayed the other ones, but they weren't part of the dominions, they weren't part of the empire. We're still fine, right?
Yeah, they actually would still be fine. Because Dominion is closer than non-Dominion in the British Empire. They were part of the British Empire. It's not like you violated your treaty with Belgium, suddenly, the entire Commonwealth is going to collapse. No. It would be, a breach of trust. It wouldn't help them. But it wouldn't mean that, Canada and Australia would suddenly never trust the British ever again. No. In fact, in the case of, Australia, I think that relations with the UK would have been a lot better had the UK stayed neutral and then not sent Australians to die in Gallipoli. And he mentioned the United States also. Again, I don't see why this would just completely mean that the UK, the British, couldn't have an alliance with the United States. They still could. They had a sort of alliance, a pretty good relation before the war. The war definitely brought the relation closer, but, they still would have had good terms with the United States. Perhaps even an alliance at some point. But, that's sort of just speculation. But yeah, this would not completely doom the British diplomatically if they had stayed neutral.
No, the amount of diplomatic damage that would be done to the British nation would be so extraordinary that it would continue to have ripple effects throughout the rest, really, of British history. To betray a trust that was so very solidly signed, so to say, would be a very, very bad move for them, again, diplomatically speaking. The only ones, really, that I think they'd be able to get along with at that point would be the Kaiserreich, and the Kaiserreich had already shown themselves to be rather hostile to the concept of pieces of paper, scraps of paper, withholding the actions of nation-states and empire builders. Not a very good idea.
Again, what I said, that's pretty hyperbolic. One broken treaty does not mean that they don't like any treaty. In fact, Germany was loyal to its allies, if not to those who they committed to neutrality. So like Austria-Hungary, during the July crisis, which started World War One, Germany stood by Austria-Hungary, promised them a blank check even, just promising to support Austria-Hungary no matter what. That was not a great move for Germany. That was not in the best German interests. And in fact, it was that decision which ultimately led to the collapse of the German Empire in World War One. So, if Germany was willing to stay loyal to Austria-Hungary, imagine how loyal they would be to a much larger ally, to the British. And in fact, I think that an Anglo-German alliance would have been possible, even probable, had Britain not joined the Allies in World War One. The British and Germans did not have any previous wars against each other. They didn't have territorial disputes. As Kaiser Wilhelm II said, quote, "I have always described myself as a friend of Britain." In fact, Kaiser Wilhelm had even tried to make an Anglo-German alliance previously. So I think that it actually would have been very possible for the British to ally themselves with the Germans.
But of course, the diplomatic aspect is only a very small part of it, because even still, when the Germans went in through Belgium, British public opinion, and of course in a democratic nation such as the United Kingdom at this time, public opinion sways many things, not necessarily everything, but many things indeed. And without public support in going to war, the British would find themselves in a very difficult situation trying to fight. Even if, yes indeed, on an official level they had promised to aid Belgium, they may have actually found themselves hamstrung, not really able to go to war if the population did not stand in support of that war.
Sort of. I'll agree that initial British public support for the war was high, but it did not last forever. And there are plenty of ways to continue fighting, despite public support. If they had public support, then they wouldn't need to worry about people who didn't want to fight. They wouldn't have had to jail anti-war activists as they did. If people were so willing to fight, then they wouldn't need to conscript soldiers to force them to fight. But they ended up having to conscript soldiers, over 2 million of them, in fact. It's hard to exactly measure British public opinion. By the end of the war, I couldn't really find anything. The closest I could find was post-war, the Oxford Oath. Basically, students at Oxford, that, classic British university, they took an oath that, and this was voted in by a pretty large margin, that this house, Oxford, will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. So if that's what they were saying, that they would not do this voluntarily, it's not really accurate to say that, British public support carried through the whole war. If no Britain supported the war, obviously it wouldn't have happened, but there was considerable resistance to the war on the British side.
What is it that made the British population stand so extraordinarily strongly in support of that conflict? That would be the rape of Belgium. Now hold on, Brandon, you may be saying, the rape of Belgium is Allied propaganda! Sure, there were some things that happened, but it wasn't anywhere near so bad as the Allied propagandists made it out to be. If the Entente powers hadn't been telling these fabricated stories of peasants being crucified along the roads, or of babies being quite literally consumed by German soldiers, well then the war would not have happened, and indeed the British public would have realized that they would have known better, had they been better informed, they would not have been willing to send their boys off to war, they would not have lost those millions and millions of lives. Sure, the British may have gone to war anyways because of those diplomatic reasons, but at least less lives would have been lost, the British would have been more willing to sign earlier peace treaties, they would not have been so very intense, so to say, in those first actions. Arguments like that can be made. But of course, it doesn't really matter in the end that the Allied propaganda, that the Entente propaganda was exaggerated, because it was still based, it was still grounded in reality. Did the German soldiers crucify farmers along the roads of Belgium? No, they didn't. But they did massacre them by the thousands. Did they really eat Belgian children? No, they did not. But they did still bayonet them and shoot them. The rape of Belgium may have been exaggerated, but it still very much took place. The German nation was a highly militarized one, a one based largely in ideals of law, order, and discipline above all else. They, as a nation, believed in the concept of collective punishment. If you move into Belgium and a town is found guilty of having some partisan activity, of them having blown up a bridge or blocked a roadway, trying to defend themselves from a foreign invasion, imagine such a crazy concept as that, trying to fight to defend yourselves from a foreign occupying army of which you have no idea what they're going to do. Sure, they're saying that they're going to treat you well, but you have absolutely no genuine guarantee that the foreign army which is invading you is actually going to live up to those words. And now, yes, of course, they're saying that they give us their word that they're not going to harm us, but they also gave us their word, in I think the 1870s with the London Conference, that they wouldn't attack us to begin with. Scraps of paper are not exactly very important to the German Kaiserreich. Of course they're going to defend themselves, of course the Belgians do. And in reprisal for these acts of self-defense, the Germans begin exacting collective punishment on the German peoples. If a railroad is destroyed, a village may be leveled. If there are indeed rumors, if there is the idea that there may be Belgian free shooters, snipers, partisans, shooting away at German soldiers, well, they would gather entire villages and mow them down, massacring them with rifle fire, with machine guns, and with bayonets. Did they eat the children? No, but they murdered them. That is sufficient in so many ways for war. I have some statistics here, if I can put on my eyes, as far as how significant the rape of Belgium truly was, and indeed just how much the Belgian people suffered during the conflict. Now again, exaggerated, but I think this tells a rather interesting story that's certainly not fabricated entirely. In the rape of Belgium, 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed directly by German soldiers. Not as a result of the occupation, but 6,000 people murdered by German soldiers. Perhaps, and this did happen multiple times, I believe this one in the village of Dinant, which was completely leveled, over 1,000 buildings burnt to the ground, and I think over 600 people killed, murdered in town streets, including, of course, some people aged 90 years and older, and the youngest victim being about a month old. Why were all of these things, why were all these people massacred? Why were all these people murdered and these villages destroyed? Well, because there were rumors of free shooters. Likely it was German firing on the other side of the village. German soldiers murder a civilian across the way, the other Germans in the column here, those are gunshots, were being fired upon, and hell is unleashed upon the village of Dinant. But of course, the 6,000 Belgians who were murdered directly by German forces is really nothing in comparison to the 60,000 Belgians who were killed overall as a result of the German occupation, as a result of the destruction of land, the burning of villages, the expulsion of Belgian civilians, things like that. In addition to the 60,000 civilians who died as a result, a direct result of this German occupation, there were another 30,000 of them who were maimed, scarred, made invalid as a result of the conflict. Some of them on a temporary basis, some of them who would never recover. And of course, these statistics record physical acts, physical crimes, deaths, and physical maimings, if you will. It does not include, of course, the untold number. I'm sure there were a great deal many of them, of victims whose wounds, shall we say, were more psychological than anything else. I'm speaking here, of course, of victims of sexual assault and other similar heinous activities.
Alright, so that was a lot. And I don't intend to defend the German actions in Belgium. They were horrible. But they were not very special, and they were usually not intentional. World War I was a total war, which means that anything that could be useful to a country was used and was targeted. So this includes, military personnel, but also it includes factories, including civilian factories. It includes land, farmland, civilians. I mean, total war is a very destructive thing, and that's just the nature of total war, that such things would happen, and it was not just the Germans who did this. Rape, he alluded to, rape happened on all sides of the war, including by the British and the French. It was not encouraged by the political or military higher-ups from Germany. But it did happen, sure, but it happened on all sides. Refugees he's going to get to. Yes, there were a lot of refugees, but again, that's the nature of this. That's the nature of total war. In terms of refugees, over 1 million Germans became refugees because of the conflict. This was not an intentional thing. Land being destroyed, refugees, being displaced from their homes. All of those, and, atrocities happening. I will admit that the execution mass punishment was something somewhat special that the Germans did, but still, a lot of the things that he mentioned, the refugees, the land destruction, the building destruction, that happened on all sides. That was just part of how this war was fought. It's a sad thing. It's why I don't like the war, why I don't think that anybody should have voluntarily gotten involved in the war. But it was part of the war, and to say that it's part of some rape of Belgium, as if they intentionally wanted to create these refugees and destroy this land, no, they didn't. That was just how it was being fought. I will get more onto similar concepts later.
But of course, that's not all. You see, as if this alone did not strike enough of a resemblance, of a similarity to the German Third Reich.
Alright, and this, there are similarities between, first of all, Reich, I don't like that term, again. But there are similarities between the German Empire and the Nazi Empire, but there are also a lot of differences. And I'm unsure what this comparison achieves. Well, actually, I do know in a sense that everybody knows that the Nazis are bad, so if you make these people look like the Nazis, then these people are gonna look bad. But other than that, I'm not sure what intellectually the comparison achieves. The German Empire acted out of pragmatism. The Nazi Empire acted genocidally. As I said, all of the things above, they're horrible. That there were so many refugees, so much destruction. But it was not intentional. They didn't want to destroy things. The Nazis did. The Nazis specifically set out, even against their best interests, even against what would have been pragmatic, they went out of their way to kill people, the Nazis. The German Empire didn't do that. And the German Empire's atrocities were on a much smaller scale. And he's going to get to forced labor. World War I labor camps were not the same as the Nazi death camps. So I don't really know what this comparison achieves other than making the German Empire look bad in ways that, I don't really like that much.
The Kaiserreich also interned about 120,000 Belgian civilians into forced labor camps. Half of these men were deported to Germany to serve in things like munitions factories and repairing and building new infrastructure. The other half of them were kept just behind the front lines, doing things like, again, repairing infrastructure, and in at least a few instances, being on the front lines to dig trenches and reserve trenches and lines of communication, things like that, being quite literally forced on the front line where Allied artillery was falling all around them. 120,000 people sent into forced labor by the Kaiserreich.
So first of all, there are disputed numbers about forced labor. He says 120,000. I've also found a source that says half that, 60,000. And also, forced labor happened on all sides. It was not just the Germans doing this. It's a horrible thing, but it was not unique to the Germans. So, for example, there was forced labor from the colonies, the Allied colonies. This also happened on all sides, but more so on the Allied side since they had more colonies. One example of colonial forced labor is the British Carrier Corps in East Africa, in which over 10 million workers were forced to do work for the British war effort, and there were about 95,000 deaths, mostly from exhaustion. And this is forced labor in British colonial Africa. And on the line, in the sort of gray area between coerced labor and forced labor, you have the Chinese foreign labor that helped the Allies when China joined the war. The Chinese laborers were in a foreign land, they faced racism, and they had to work 10 hours a day, 7 days a week with few days off, oftentimes near or at the front lines. This is, Chinese foreign labor. And also conscription, I've mentioned above. Conscription is a form of forced labor, which, as I said, the British and the other allies participated in. Again, I don't want to defend Germany here. What they did in Belgium was horrible, but it was not unique. Everybody was doing it. It's not like the Germans were the Huns, as the propaganda said. They were just another country acting like countries did in this conflict. Horribly.
These are activities which we so commonly associate the Third Reich with, that sometimes we forget the Second Reich did them at all, that we forget that the Kaiserreich was also, by its own merit, in its own standards, not a very nice nation. 1.5 million Belgian refugees were displaced as a result of the invasion of Belgium, of the destruction of villages, the roving and ravaging, if you will, of the armies, and, well, now on one hand you may think to yourself that the Germans would, not necessarily be okay with these refugees, but that they may not want them necessarily in Belgium itself. After all, they are proving a difficulty. Refugees, you have to feed refugees. You have to worry about partisanal activity among the refugees. Things like that. These are people who are very hostile to your reign, and now they are displaced, they are homeless, they have nothing to lose. 1.5 million of these people roving around the countryside.
Again, refugees and all that destruction wasn't special. Again, as I said, there were over 1 million German refugees from the war, so this is, again, not an intentional thing that they were doing.
Well, you may think to yourself, well, something has to be done about them. Second World War Germany, of course, would probably just start putting them into camps. But Kaiserreich Germany is not really at that level. They're not that bad. But all the same, the things that they did to them were not exactly kind. You see, Germany, in the, again, First World War Germany, it doesn't sound like First World War Germany from how they're usually portrayed. In order to prevent these 1.5 million Belgian refugees from escaping the German occupation, and yes, in fairness, many of them may well have taken arms up against the German right, so it's understandable if they want to keep tabs on them, anyway, I suppose. In order to prevent these men from escaping, well, these refugees, some of them were men, some were children, some were women, all those sorts of things. In order to prevent them from escaping, the Germans established what they referred to as the Todesdraht, what the Dutch referred to as the Dodendraad. In English, the death wire, or the wire of death. It was an electric fence built all along the border with the Netherlands, designed again to prevent anyone from crossing over. I think a couple hundred volts were sent through the thing. I've got the exact number, but I can list it down below here. A number of hundreds of volts sent coursing through that wire to, of course, immediately kill anyone who dared trying to cross over it. And of course, the Belgians did try to employ a number of different means to get over that wire, oftentimes unsuccessfully. And in fact, as well, in order to prevent those civilians from attempting to get over the wire through whatever means they could derive, German soldiers who were patrolling these fences did indeed have direct orders to fire upon and summarily execute anyone caught within, between 100 and 500 meters of the wire who could not immediately justify their presence there. About 3,000 people, 3,000 Belgian civilians, would be killed as a result of this electric fence preventing people from leaving. Symbolism, again, strikingly similar to, much later, concentration camps. All of Belgium wired in. Did the rape of Belgium take place the way that the Allied propaganda said that it did? No, it did not. It was exaggerated. It was made to be larger than life, to really make the Germans out to be the true Hunnic enemy that had to be quashed, no matter what, because they were going to be the destroyers of civilization itself. Now, is that the case? No, of course that's not the case. But that does not suddenly mean that the Second Reich, that the Kaiserreich, that the German Empire, was a very good power. It does not mean that they were behaving themselves in Belgium. Just because the Nazis are oftentimes portrayed in our video games and in our films as mustache-twirling, absolute pure evil comic book style villains without any at all redeeming qualities, just because that's a little bit much of an exaggeration, that there were indeed people who were simply deeply flawed within the Nazi ranks, it does not suddenly mean that Nazi Germany is forgiven of its crimes. In the same exact way, the Kaiserreich cannot be forgiven its crimes just because these same crimes were later on, and indeed contemporarily, exaggerated in other ways.
Alright, that's true. The German Empire did do horrible things which should not be forgotten. But again, as I've said, and as I will say later, it wasn't special. Everybody was doing them, so you can't say that, well, I mean, you can, but you shouldn't say that this was like some special thing that, deserves a special response. Because, it wasn't. The rape of Belgium was, as normal as you can get for World War I. Again, it's bad. I don't want to defend Germany, but attacking them like this is an overreaction.
The rape of Belgium happened. It happened very, very, very much so. And it was that rape of Belgium that really drove those British peoples to support the war with Germany. Had it not happened, the British probably would not have been so very keen on the war. But indeed, this Allied propaganda, which is again seated in reality, very much whipped up the British people into this moralistic frenzy that they had to go to war. What are they going to do? After the British people had promised Belgium that they would defend them, that they would support them in exactly this sort of circumstance, not only are they going to break that promise, but are they going to be looking at the atrocities that the Germans are visiting upon these Belgian people, and are they then going to say, no, it's not worth it?
Yeah, actually, they could say that. I would say that even. Because I don't think that the rape of Belgium was enough. I don't think that it is enough to justify the millions of British who died in World War I. Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because horrible things were happening in Belgium doesn't mean that sending millions of British off to die, that doesn't fix it. It only makes the problem worse. It's only more deaths. It's only more destruction. So, that's generally my opinion. Because I don't think that British involvement fixed things. Even if, the rape of Belgium was enough to justify war, or to justify some action, it was not enough to kill millions of people in response. Because, again, that only makes things worse. It's sort of an example of the medicine being worse than the ailment. Because it's just a lot of death that didn't need to happen. Again, he says, no, it's not worth it. I don't think it is worth it, for that reason.
The problems we were talking about earlier of diplomacy, of the position that would put the British nation in future, could be even worse than if the Germans had just walked through the region. There was no way for the British to betray that trust and come out on the end of it looking like anything close to a good guy. And of course, public perception, again, in this time period, matters massively. Even the British public themselves, the British people wanted that war. They all very much were very keen on making it happen, so to say. It's logical, alongside necessary, that they did, in fact, go to war. It was not a matter of the British people being forced into it by any sort of, imperial elite or something like that.
Well, for many people it was. For many people they didn't want to go to war, but, see what I said about conscription. For 2 million British people, they were forced into fighting by an imperial elite against their will. So this isn't entirely correct what he's saying here. I mean, again, there were certainly British volunteers, but not every British person supported it, and not to the extent that would have been necessary for complete, voluntary support of the war.
Sorry, that's a long rant, I know, but you've come to be used to those sorts of things, I think, by this point in this channel. That is not, of course, the only reason for the British to go to war. That's the moral reason, if you will, the moral justification for the German Empire being stopped. Let's also look, if we will, at the practical considerations, as far as the actual realpolitik is concerned. What would have happened had the British nation not entered into the conflict?
So, at this point, he's getting into speculation. What would have happened? We don't know for sure what would have happened, because it's in the realm of alternate history. So I'm going to give my speculation about what would happen if the British didn't join the war. So I speculate that it would have been a lighter war with a lighter peace. Basically, if the British hadn't gotten involved, then the Schlieffen Plan would have been successful. The Germans could have gotten through France pretty quickly, and then moved on to Russia as they had planned to. And once they, defeated France and Russia, it would have been a pretty quick war, maybe over by Christmas, but probably would have lasted until like early 1915 or something. Either way, it would not have been the complete destructive war that World War I actually was. And since it was not as big of a war, Germany would not have felt the need or felt the want to have. Well, actually, I'm going to get into that when he mentions the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But what I speculate is that it would not have been, this world-changing thing. Basically, I think that on the Western Front, Germany would have annexed Luxembourg, maybe parts of. Yeah, they would have annexed Luxembourg, and then they would have annexed the French and Belgian colonial empires, and then, or maybe they wouldn't have even bothered with Belgium, since Belgium should have been neutral, and, as a reward for, not being, a voluntary enemy, Belgium would have gotten to keep its Congo colony. But anyway, and then on the Eastern Front, I'm guessing that Germany would have established some puppet governments. They would have taken a lot of Russian territory in Poland and in the Baltic states, maybe Finland, and they would have turned those into sort of German puppet states. But otherwise, the Russian Empire would have remained intact. It would not have been the Soviet Union, and France would still have remained a country, just without a colonial empire, without as big of a colonial empire. It would not have been the, huge numbers of deaths that it was in our timeline. That's my speculation about if the British had not joined the war. So let's hear his and see if that's very realistic.
Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the German Empire could have won the war without the British getting involved. I mean, I think it's actually not that it's not that unfair to say that that the Germans could well have won the war without the British getting involved, because of course the French Empire would have lost massively in terms of materials, in terms of manpower, in terms of support, in terms of their entire left flank being largely reliant on British support to actually hold that line. So let's say, indeed, that the Germans, as a result of, say, the British not entering into the war, are able to defeat the French nation. Now, they're not going to do the same thing that they did to Belgium, to France, obviously, because they aren't fighting a war there. They're not interested. They're not, as the Nazis were, ideologically driven to visit these atrocities on the civilian populations. Merely, they were doing so as what they viewed as a practical attempt to subjugate the population. It didn't work in Belgium, of course. Collective punishment never really works, historically speaking, not in the modern time periods, at least. But but at least, the Germans they were thinking practically in how they did it, not so much ideologically hate-driven as the later Third Reich was. So France would not necessarily have suffered in those ways under the German Reich. But if the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is anything to go by, and how the Germans treated the Russian nation after their own defeat in the conflict, how they removed, I think, 25% of the nation's industrial capacity, how they took 75% of its resources, how they basically gutted the population of the Russian Empire, reducing its power significantly. Basically, they made Russia into a third-rate power as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, they did not annex any Russian territory, but they made tributary states, they made protectorate states, they made buffer states all along the border, many of which the idea was at least to put them underneath German princelings, so they would again have that allegiance to the German Empire. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, maybe that could be a whole other separate video in and of itself, but to put it rather simply, destroyed the Russian nation so very completely. So much so that it really shocked the world. In fact, a lot of people in the Treaty of Versailles were saying, not only they were saying that it wasn't too harsh, they were saying it wasn't harsh enough because of what the Germans did to the Russians at Brest-Litovsk.
Alright, so a couple things. First of all, he said that it destroyed the Russian nation. It destroyed the Russian Empire, but not the Russian nation. A lot of the resources that he said were gutted were just became resources of newly independent nations who had long suffered under the Russian Empire, the Russian monarchy. These new nations probably, which in our timeline included, Poland and the Baltic states and, Belarus and Ukraine and whatnot, they probably would not have, in our timeline, were not completely free. They were definitely German puppets to some extent. And I'm guessing that a similar situation would have happened had the British not gotten involved. But I would still say that it's an improvement from Tsarist control, because the Tsarist regime was brutal. It was an absolute monarchy, in which, entire groups were just, constantly being, destroyed and attacked. See the pogroms on the Jews as an example, in which plenty of groups were exploited. I see, the puppet states, as at least an improvement from that. I would much rather be a puppet, under the Kaiser than just direct control under a Tsar. And I'm guessing, in my speculation, that had the British not gotten involved and it would have been a lighter war, the Germans would not have they would not have had such a harsh treaty on the Russian Empire. That treaty was born out of just the bloodshed, the long fighting of World War I, that the Germans did not want to repeat ever again. And they want to weaken Russia to such a point that it would never happen again. I think that in an alternate history where Britain did not join World War I, that Germany would not have had such a harsh treaty with Russia. Maybe they would have had, Poland and the Baltic states and Finland be, independent, but other than that, leave the empire alone, leave the empire as it had been. Again, it's my speculation, but he's speculating too, and I think that my theory is just as plausible as his.
If we can say potentially that there's no real reason, I don't think, why not, the Germans could well have done the same thing, something very similar at least, to the French people. Had the Germans defeated France in the First World War, look at the position again that the British would be put in. They themselves would still have their strong navy, and they would not have lost those millions of lives, absolutely. But there's always going to be another war. You cannot believe that we have achieved peace in our time, truly ever. It's always, historically speaking at least, the idea of there's not going to be any more war has quite literally never been the case. It's never been the case.
Never been the case. I disagree with that. Obviously no peace is eternal, and there are almost always smaller peripheral wars, but there have been, and in fact there currently is one, long periods of general peace. For example, the 99 years before World War I were generally pretty peaceful in Europe. So, obviously no peace would have lasted forever, but had there been another, 99-year period, or another long period like there was, before World War I or after World War II, then that would have been a long time for things to change, politically. And who knows what would have happened at that point. What would an alternate, 2017 look like? Who knows? But also, there's no reason to believe that, there would have necessarily been a war between, Germany and Britain. I'm gonna let him speak a bit more, and then I'm gonna get to that point further.
When the next war comes, this is a time period as well, of course, in which most people are always planning ahead for the next war. That's why they weakened Germany at Versailles in attempts to lessen the effects of the next war, or make sure that the next war would not be Germany doing all these terrible things to the rest of Europe. Well, in that next war, Germany would control more or less the entirety of the East, because Russia would be no longer a factor. Not that they were too much ultimately a factor in the First World War, because they did not do very well, but Russia would be completely non-factor. So Germany, because it has all those buffer states, would not even have to worry initially about fighting a two-front war, which is of course the main thing that was holding them back in the First World War. The idea of it being a two-front. That's why they had to strike. That's why they were in such a precarious position. France as well may well have been devastated. They may well have lost colonial possessions. They may well have lost industrial capacity. They may have lost population. They may have lost military capacity. They would have been weakened, possibly even destroyed if they were carved up in the same way that Eastern Europe was. They could well as well have been a non-factor. And the next time, if you have suddenly a position where you have the British Empire and then a continent effectively under German dominion, domination, German hegemony, the English Channel looks thinner and thinner every single day. Look at the position that Britain was in the Second World War. The Channel protected them, yes, but would not have done so forever. That was a very precarious situation that the British nation found themselves in. They were very, very close, at least it was a lot of time, they were very close to facing the threat of invasion. Ultimately, would Nazi Germany have ever stood a chance of really winning the war? I don't think so. But the idea being that the Second World War was awful, absolutely awful for the British nation, in that they were being bombed and all these different things. And if they were to allow in the First World War the Germans to achieve in a more solid and long-term basis, without continual conflict, that sort of hegemony over the conflict, the next war would have looked exactly like the Second World War, only with the Germans immediately having all of those benefits.
The next war would have looked exactly like the Second World War? I doubt that. I pretty heavily doubt that. First of all, had Britain not gotten involved and the German Empire won World War I, there would not have been a Nazi ideology driving Germany toward war. There would not have necessarily been an Anglo-German rivalry at all, because, again, as I said, it's actually very probable that they could have had an alliance had Britain not became part of the Allies. And also, I don't think that there would have been a war, because peace would benefit Germany. Germany had, a much faster growing, population and industry than Britain did. So it would have been in Germany's best interest to preserve peace as they had before World War I. So I don't think that there really would have been a war closely after World War I had Britain not gotten involved. So it would not have been the same as the Second World War.
Before the First World War even broke out, Germany was the most populous nation in Europe. They had the largest and strongest army by far. They had a navy which was beginning to rival the Royal Navy. Their industrial capacity was the strongest of any nation in Europe. As soon as the German Empire united in the 1870s, they were a titanic powerhouse of an empire, of a nation. Overnight, the British Empire and the French empires have a third rival, which in fact is greater than them in terms of economic output and population growth rate and whatnot. That's horrifying. And if all those natural advantages which the Germans had at their foundation were to be multiplied even further by getting rid of, as a threat, the Russians and the French to either side of them, and the British were all of a sudden themselves with no allies because they betrayed their allies by not going to war, they alone facing off against this juggernaut of a German military?
Again, who's to say that they would be enemies? He is, but I doubt that.
They would not have stood a chance. What are they going to do? Sign a treaty with Germany? Again, we see how that ended in the past. The British Empire would effectively be ended in terms of its global control. It would only exist at that point by the grace of the German Empire, which could at will basically destroy the thing unless the British stopped them there in 1914.
Alright, technically, at that point, if the German Empire wanted to, they could destroy the British Empire, but again, that would be a massive war, millions of lives, and they would not have had a reason to do that. Again, they had no reason to be enemies, and peace would have benefited Germany. So they would not have the Germans would not have chosen a war with Britain.
The British stopped them there in 1914. Not only is this exception,
This is the reality of the thing. No, it's speculation. He's speculating, I'm speculating. We don't know what would have happened. We only know it did happen. And according to the facts that we have, what actually happened in the war, I don't think that it was a wise decision for Britain to join. Because of all of the lives, all of the, moral catastrophes that happened on all sides, I don't think that it was a good idea for the British to join.
Not only is this the perception, not only is this the idea, but it is very much the reality of the thing as well. Again, look at Brest-Litovsk, convinced that the Germans would have tried something further, something similar to that in the West against France, and in that sort of situation, it would not be very good for the British. The only allies the British would have would probably be the Americans, who are also, of course, extraordinarily interested in their splendid little isolationism. Right, so this was a rather ranty video, I understand, but it genuinely bothers me, is the thing, that there are so many people out there who are always going on about how, well, really there were no bad guys in the First World War, or really the war was pointless, really Britain shouldn't have gotten involved, people saying that Britain's getting involved was a waste, it was pointless, that indeed some people even deign to say that the British actively made the wrong move by siding with France in the First World War, which just boggles the mind.
Right. For starters, she said that, that there were good guys, there were bad guys. No, I don't think there were. Obviously, the Germans did horrible things, but so did the Allies. I've listed them. There were also German refugees, there were also rapes that the Allies committed, there was forced labor on the Allied side, there was conscription, there was, the near million of, forced African workers who died for the British. There were also the colonial troops who didn't have any representation in British Parliament, yet they were forced to fight, and the Australians were forced to die in Gallipoli because the British joined. Again, I'm not saying that the Allies were the bad guys, but they weren't the good guys either. They didn't have, the great moral high ground that, Brandon is saying that they do.
Given what the Germans were doing in conflict. Rather than the war being pointless, I do believe it was moral, it was necessary, and it was, of course, logical why the British wanted it. It became, yes, a tragedy that so many lives were so completely destroyed as a result of the war. The British Empire, British people suffered massively as a result of that. But that suffering was not without purpose, it was not without cause. We cannot look at the First World War and say that it was useless, unlike the Second World War, which at least had a moral point to it. The First World War absolutely had a purpose.
I mean, it wasn't completely pointless. There, obviously, as I said at the beginning, there were causes, but I don't think they were good causes.
That was the defense of the free peoples of Britain, of France, of Belgium, later on of even the United States, it might be argued, of indeed the Russians, although the Russians weren't really free, they were quite terrible in their own right, but that's a whole other subject for another day.
But what he's saying about, the defense of the free peoples, not really. First of all, calling the British free isn't exactly true, because less than a sixth of the UK population could vote in 1914, because of property requirements and to women not having suffrage. And remember, this is not, the entire British Empire. This is just the United Kingdom. Less than a sixth could vote. And of course, this is excluding the billions of colonized people who were not given suffrage and were just forced into service under the British. They were not free. And freedom was not an Allied goal. Perhaps the Allies were a bit more free than the Germans, since the Germans had, a monarch. And unlike the British, the monarch in Germany did have a considerable amount of power. But it's not like the Germans were completely unfree, and they were more free than the Russians were. Freedom was not an Allied goal. It may have been an unintended consequence to an extent, but it was not an Allied goal, and it was not worth the millions of people who died.
Indeed, the First World War was not pointless. And as well, I understand that, given that this was sort of a ranty video, that I may have slipped up at a few points in this. I may have said a few things that later on I'm thinking, no, I need to qualify that more. And so if there are going to be any corrections in this video that are not popping up around me during the video, please do look at the description down below, where you can find any sorts of updates that I may need to make for the video.
As of this video's production, I looked in the description. I did not see any corrections that he made. So, either he's looked at this again and he thinks all of it's great, or maybe he just hasn't gotten around to adding corrections. Either way, I'm just going with what I've been given. Now, he basically concludes, thanks people for watching the video, talks about his Patreon. I'm gonna get to a couple arguments that I didn't see really in his video that I also just want to make. He mentioned the 1839 treaty with Belgium that the British made, promising that the British would intervene if Belgian neutrality was broken. I will say that the British Parliament at the time represented less than 5% of the UK population. Again, this is not the British Empire, this is just the UK. Less than 5% were represented. None of the people who fought in World War I had, signed that piece of legislation. None of them had voted for that piece of legislation. None of them had voted for a representative who voted for that piece of legislation. So I don't think that a person should be forced to fight and die because of a century-old treaty that only represented 5% of the population. And I don't think it's worth that many deaths to honor that treaty. Again, honoring treaties I think is important, but it's not that important. It's not worth all of the deaths. And also, he mentioned that, the rape of Belgium was justification for joining the war, to which I'm gonna ask, what atrocities justify going to war? I'm gonna use the United States as an example. The United States has done numerous atrocities. Thousands of indigenous Americans are put on reservations on camps, and even to this day, they're still on reservations in camps, where the economic conditions are just horrible. We have basically colonial control over Guam and Puerto Rico, the United States. And even in our own capital, Washington, D.C. is supposed to be like the center of worldwide democracy. The people in Washington, D.C. do not have representation in the federal government. The United States has also toppled many democratically elected governments in Iran and Argentina and other places. We've funded terrorist groups in the United States, including the Taliban and Colombian death squads. We've supported ruthless and dictatorial regimes in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, not to mention our atrocities that we did in Vietnam. All of that the United States has done is, I believe, far worse than the rape of Belgium. Anyway, back to what I was saying. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. So, seeing all of these American atrocities that were worse than the rape of Belgium, do you think that the UK should go to war with the United States, that the UK should sanction the United States, that the UK should cut all ties to the United States because of these things? I'm gonna guess that your answer is no. And why? Well, I think because war does not reduce atrocities and does not actually punish the war criminals. If, just Canada went to war with the United States over American atrocities that we commit, who would benefit and who would suffer? Well, first of all, in terms of suffering, it would mean millions of deaths by American civilians, by American soldiers, and by, of course, anybody attacking the United States. So that's just more atrocities. And as I said before, two wrongs don't make a right. And of course, who's punished? The higher-ups in the defense and the politics would not be harmed, because they're the higher-ups. They're the people in power. The people harmed would be just the innocent civilians and soldiers fighting for their country. That's why, even despite, the horrible things that the U.S. government has done, we shouldn't just go attacking Americans. And, of course, the same with other countries, such as Germany. The average German soldier who would have fought and died in World War I was not a slaughterer of Belgian children. They did not rape Belgian women. They did not do these horrible things. They were just people under orders of higher-ups fighting for their country. Most of them. And these are the people you kill by going to war. You don't kill the higher-ups by, going to war. You just kill millions of common people on their side and millions of common soldiers from your own country. That is not good, in my opinion. And, if we think about it, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the person who I think more than any other person is responsible for World War I, what punishment did he face for doing that, for starting this horrible war? Well, none. He actually, after the war, he fled to the Netherlands, where he lived a happy and peaceful life until dying of old age several decades later. So, Britain going to war did not stop the people it was supposed to stop. It only killed millions of innocent people, which is why I don't think the UK should have gone to war against Germany. So in conclusion, politically, I don't think that Britain benefited. They could have stayed neutral and saved millions of British lives and tons of industrial capacity from a pointless conflict. These are resources that could have been put to better use. And they also could have, forged an alliance with Germany. That would have been a powerful alliance, and it would have helped Britain considerably. And morally, I do not think that the Allies were better than the Central Powers. They all committed numerous atrocities, as I've mentioned above, and they all did horrible things in the fighting. Besides, even if the Allies were significantly better, intervention still would not have been worth the moral cost of the millions of dead soldiers and civilians that were caused by British involvement. So that's my take on this. Yeah. Brandon, if you're watching, then I would like to hear your response to my response. Anybody else who's watching, first of all, thank you for making it through this, I think, hour-long at this point video. It's a pretty long-winded thing, but I do care a lot about World War I. It is an area of interest for me. Again, at Brandon, I don't mean this as a personal attack. I just, I'm sort of a pacifist myself, and so I would want to defend that position. And, yeah, anybody else who wants to offer feedback, feel free to in the comments or anywhere else. I would love to have a conversation about this topic. And, yeah, that's about it. Thank you for, sticking around, and, peace out, Line Gang.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye to Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary.